Hello and welcome to Adapt with DanetteFM. I'm Danette Menzies, the host of this season. We're in season 3 and we're talking about experimentation. Super excited for today's conversation, but I'd love to welcome in my co-host, Jez Menzies. Welcome, Jez.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Danette. Yes, I'm very excited to be here for season 3. I'm sure as people will hear in these interviews, this season is really exciting and the conversations that you get into are really interesting. But for people that are joining you for the first time or joining us for the first time, Danette, you're an adaptability expert that, deals with many things. You've worked in training and facilitation for a long time, but you've got a background as an accountant. But more than that, if people love learning about adaptability in a time of ever-changing, the world's changing constantly, you've actually got a resource that this podcast is the companion to, which is The Adaptable Leader, which is a book people can pick up right now. The world's changing constantly. There's many things constantly changing, and you need to stay adaptable, and you need to experiment, which is the theme of the season here. So this is a companion podcast to that great book.
Thank you, Jez. Thank you.
That's all right. Well, Danette, part of what we do here at Adapt with DanetteFM is we talk to different experts about different things around the world. And we sort of get into what's happening around the world. And we'll talk to Sophie, a sort of expert who has global links and talks about the power of sort of global connections during changing times. But before we get into that conversation, Danette, we always start by looking around the world, actually, at a segment we like to call Adapt the News. Alrighty, and welcome to Adapt the News. This is the segment where we like to take a news story from around the world and we like to sort of see how it applies to adaptability. So today, Danette, we have one. Alrighty, everybody. Well, this is the news story today and it's from positive.news. And the headline, Ireland's basic income for artists to become permanent. So, this week, Ireland's government announced that the country's basic income scheme for artists will be made permanent. Introduced to help creatives during the pandemic, it offered participants a weekly stipend of €325 in a bid to kickstart grassroots culture. The €25 million program helped more than 2,000 artists, although many more applied. According to an independent study, the scheme generated €100 million in social and economic benefits to Ireland's economy. Now, I thought this was something a little bit different, in terms of experimentation. This is a kind of experimental way to approach arts and arts funding. So, Danette, I want to get your thoughts on this news story.
One, I love the news story, and good on the Ireland government for putting this in place, because often the logical brain will go, why do we invest in the arts? But in fact, when you think about where we need to go and where I suppose the strength of us as humans is that the creative areas are where we start to innovate, where we can experiment. And they actually bring more than just the initial dollar return. And as we saw, for €21 million, they got 100 million. So it's a 5-time return based on investing in a sector that often is forgotten and in fact is super important. And in the world we're going into, I think is even more important, particularly with AI and stuff. This is where we can show our humanness and bring in that creativity and innovation. So I love the story and I love positive.news.
Me too. They're a great spot for me to sometimes check for headlines. I wanted to say just two things about this because I think it's really exciting, and I love that Ireland sort of just tried this, just to sort of, speaking of experimentation, just a kind of experimental approach to managing the arts sector. And I think it's a great way to build new culture because in that way, you're investing in people that like to make culture. So there's a definite outcome of culture is going to be generated as a result of this. But the other thing that I think it shares an interesting sort of note with is this heated rivalry show. Have you heard anything about this, Danette?
No, tell me more, Jez.
Okay, so this is a really interesting story from sort of the end of 2025, and it's sort of the legs of it are still running through to now. And there was this show created called Heated Rivalry, which some people listening to this will know of, some people may not. And essentially the premise of the show is it's a book-to-screen adaptation of a romance kind of novel that's about two all-star hockey players who kind of fall in love. Okay? That's kind of the premise of the show.
Yep.
And it was made by Canada's sort of national TV sort of arts funding.
Yes.
Small budget, small show. This show has now exploded. It's been one of the biggest shows over the last 2 months. It's had over 600 million watches. It's been
Wow.
distributed everywhere. And what it's done for the Canadian economy has created this really interesting thing where different parts, because one of the characters represents Canada in the Olympics, Canada has officially created that jacket as part of like an Olympic thing you can buy. And the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney's talked about it. And it's become this
Wow.
sort of global phenomenon, again, based out of the art. So you think of like a small budget, small independent sort of show. It just shows sometimes the impact of that can be really, really powerful. So anyway,
I
that's
love
another
that.
example from a different country, but shows, sort of investing in this is a different way to approach. And I guess for me, what does it make you think about when you think about this, about how maybe businesses could apply some of the lessons from this?
So I think moving to the more creative. So what I love about creatives is they'll use their left and their right brain and come up with new ideas. So rather than going, this is how we've always done it, which is not going to cut the mustard in the world we're going in, it's like, okay, what is everyone seeing that's different? How could we use this? And I love the idea that, some investment is required. So going, well, you just got to make it happen is not going to make it happen. You have to invest, you have to have some structure around it. And being okay just going, well, let's give it a go. And what's the worst that can happen? Doesn't work. But being able to try that experimentation can lead to extraordinary rewards, as both those case studies show. So awesome story, Jets.
Yes, yes. Well, Danette, speaking of global stories, we're talking to returning friend of the show, this is their third time in 3 seasons they're on the
Yes.
show, Sophie Krantz. Did you want to talk a little bit about anything for people to keep their eyes open before they watch this interview that you've had, and anything that you want to share about Sophie?
Yeah, so we invite Sophie back every year because she's an amazing global strategist. She very early on shared with me, you need to create a global network because then you get access to intel that will help you be able to experiment, be innovative, etc. I loved one of her bits of advice. I'm just going to read it here because I wrote it down. Is when we're experimenting, it can become something that becomes heavy in an organization. And what I loved is her advice of be lighter, be playful. And the other thing I really loved, and there was so much in this conversation because of her background, but she quoted a quote by Steve Blanks, which was, get out of the building. And I think it's really, our brain loves certainty. So when we're thinking about we might innovate, we might experiment, we want to sit often behind the computer and just make it so. But actually, the gold is out there talking to people, observing what people are doing, etc. So that getting up and moving around, talking to your networks, finding out what's going on for them, absolutely can help us experiment in super successful ways. What about you, Jess? Was there anything particularly you thought would be helpful?
Well, look, I think they are all great observations. I just think when you're talking about learning about Sophie's background, I encourage people to check out Sophie's actual background in this video. That's an exciting part of the interview, so we'll check that out. So anyway, Danette, without further ado, let's throw to your conversation with Sophie Krantz.
Welcome to season 3, where we're speaking about experimentation in order to be able to be more adaptable. And today I'm super excited because we have our third time returning guest, Sophie Krantz, joining us today. Sophie, I'd love for you, for those who may not have heard other podcasts with you, and just for you to do a little introduction, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi, Danette. Delighted to be back. And for anyone watching, yes, this is a boat. And at the heart of it, I'm an explorer. I really love getting out and exploring the world. And I'm super lucky to have been able to work in many countries around the world in potentially better times geopolitically and so on. And so I have a background in international trade and investment, and have worked developing trade and investment strategies at the United Nations, worked for global Fortune 500 in the financial services in Zurich, and negotiated Blue Scopes free trade agreements. Essentially, I love doing business that crosses borders and using business as a way to break down barriers and connect people and economic opportunity. And now I'm based in Melbourne on my floating office, let's say.
And that floating office is gorgeous. So, Sophie, welcome back. And given the theme of experimentation, I thought I'd really love, because it means different things to different people, if you wouldn't mind by starting about defining experimentation in terms of both leadership and organisations, particularly with your global background.
Certainly those of us that have been in our careers for, 10 plus years, we sense that the world is changing, and we hear that it's changing so quickly, this fast moving world. And yet we tend to default to what we know, who we know, and how we work. And how do we sort of bridge that gap? And what I know is that experimentation is one of, or if not the very best way to bridge that gap. And so experimentation is about creating space to think and act differently, albeit with some boundaries. And so we can spend time. I like to think my floating office allows me and clients that come on board for strategy workshops, it allows us to be untethered. But we also, wherever we are in the world, we can spend time in the sandpit or the sandbox. And when we do that with limited time and set resources, we can test, we can validate, we can adapt ideas, initiatives, ventures, whatever it is that we're focusing on. And we can do that before committing. It's not a case of us having to be right, to know it all. We're able to be a little lighter and more playful in the world. We can explore, indeed experiment and expand who we know, what we know, and how we work. And we can build relationships and capability to go further, faster in this changing world without overexposing our business to risk.
It sounds fun, doesn't it?
Indeed. It is so much fun to not have to know it all or do it all even.
Love that freedom. So let's go to our next question, which is, can you share an example of a situation where experimentation really worked and got an outcome that maybe wasn't even expected?
Yeah, Steve Blank, the American entrepreneur, famously said, "Get out of the building." And this, of course, this quote, but this sentiment is where real insight is. And an example that comes to mind, Danette, is when recently working with a food business in Asia. They were looking to expand into the pet food market. And this was through being a coach on an exponential organization, an EXO corporate innovation sprint, which is specifically designed to spend 10 to 12 weeks in the sandpit or the sandbox. And what we started off doing was looking at what can we leverage? What are the underlying talents, assets, resources, networks, and so on? Because we don't want to have to start from scratch if we don't need to. What can we build on internally? And they explored global shifts in pet food production, packaging, distribution. What can AI do for pet food? Even if it's personalized pet food, what can, innovative production methods? It could be, for example, what's a meat alternative yet delivers the same nutrient value in a cost-effective way? These sorts of things. Really, a tour around the world of what's possible in this space. And that, of course, sparked dozens of new product ideas. And yet, when they tested these ideas against the global market, they found that many of these ideas already existed, both by peers, existing players, and new entrants. And quite often, it's the new entrants, indeed the startups, that were very agile, very adaptable, that had really impressive innovations. And they weren't on this quite large player's radar. They just weren't within their worldview or their line of sight. And so that didn't stop them. It can be a bit deflating when we're experimenting and we're like, this is an amazing idea or initiative. And then, oh, someone's already done that. But of course, that's gold. We want that. That's really important information or intelligence. And indeed, for them, it accelerated them. So they used these insights to refine and to leapfrog. And so they built on what was already proven elsewhere and avoided duplication, and they moved in a faster and smarter way. And so, of course, if they'd stayed inside their building, they would have missed it.
Such a great quote and a great example. That's fascinating. So then my next one is, what challenges have you seen when people start experimenting? And do you have any examples of where perhaps the experimenting didn't go so well?
Yeah, two stand out, Danette, and building on Steve Blank's advice to get out of the building, the first challenge that leads to not great successes when we stay local and limited. And so, of course, quite often we have experiments that are shaped to satisfy internal decision makers. We've all worked with or for leaders who kind of know best. They want almost to validate what they know and their position in the market. And that, of course, that focus on giving leaders or, it could be committees, it could be boards, it could be executive teams, giving them more of what they want ignores the reality of what's shifting in the world, what's possible due to emerging technology. Where's the best talent in the world? Where's capital that we can access with potentially less limitations than locally? There's also competition. Does competition come from domestically, where we're sitting and working, or even our international footprint? Does competition come from the usual suspects, those big players that we've always, had on our radar? What's outside of our immediate view, often in other parts of the world? This is where experimentation sometimes, the sandbox is to play, and we want to play, we want to cast the net as far and wide as possible. And it's those leaders who want teams to stay within whatever those boundaries are. And I know in Australia, we see it. There's a fantastic young entrepreneur, a female entrepreneur, who's building a really impressive tech business. And when she goes to investors in Australia, trying to raise funding, she's told that she's too ambitious.
Wow.
And yet for her to have that conversation, those conversations outside of Australia, she may well be told you're not ambitious enough, because the total addressable market, that market that will use your technology, is bigger than you're setting your sights on. And
Yeah.
so the immediate environment around us can make us play that smaller game. So we don't that confines and defines our experimentation. And then there's another challenge that can lead to poorer results, is pivoting too early. And so, for example, working with teams who are defining, trying to de-risk into intangibles if they are in the business of making a widget. And certainly here in Australia, we want to put less things on ships, particularly at the moment with trade barriers and tariffs and all that stuff. So when we look at diversifying into intangibles and we want to validate where in the world is there demand for that, it could be that we just want to take our expertise and we want to go and run virtual workshops or in-person workshops in other parts of the world, for example. Let's take that. And what happens is we have individuals or small teams that agree on running some interviews to confirm, of course, validate the demand. And what can happen is they have one or two discussions and then they'll pivot. And that's not experimentation, that's a distraction. And so good experimentation, of course, needs some structure. It needs to be untethered from assumptions and yet anchored to a framework. And that framework, it can be useful to think of it as a scientific experiment, a scientific test. how can it be time bound? What's the hypothesis that we're trying to prove or disprove? What are the set resources? Otherwise, we're just guessing. And so, Danette, that's what comes to mind to me. And just while I'm thinking about this, I'd love to know what are the challenges that you're seeing with your clients?
Very similar. And with all the stuff that's going on globally, just trying to navigate those rapid changes and, what does this mean for us? What does it mean for, us globally as well? And I think just because it's sort of in a lot of ways unprecedented, all of the things that are sort of coming together globally at the moment. But I also love that I'm seeing some optimism as well. So people, and I think I love this about, when we're adaptable, while a lot of people will go, which our brain's natural tendency is to sort of shut down and get stuck on the problem, people are opening their brains to there's also, wherever there's risk and stuff, there's also opportunities if you're playing around and experimenting. So my next question is, in organisations, how do we actually encourage and allow more experimentation?
Experimentation, it's what I love about the work we do with clients, Danette, is our ability to take that outsider's view, looking in, and an observation of very well-meaning leaders perhaps haven't needed to deal with so many shifting forces out there in the world. They can give people tools. So, for example, we will give everyone access to Gen AI. It might be ChatGPT, for example. And to give the tool isn't necessarily enough. We also need to give tools and permission. And so really thinking about what's the space we need to play? What are the global intelligence sources? Where are we most impacted by these global shifts? And if the world's most significant trends, threats, and technologies come from far from where any one of us live and work, what do we need to know? And how do we structure time in that sandpit or sandbox? It could be structured sprints. It could be 90-day innovation sprints. But also, let's give clarity on what good experimentation looks like. And so not everything needs a full scale rollout. And we know that when we invest significant time, energy, resources, particularly financial resources and talent to big initiatives, that can be quite risky, and particularly in the current economic environment and with so much uncertainty globally, that's a lot harder to get approval and it's a lot harder to get the reward. And so let's de-risk it by making it quite clear on what success looks like in terms of this is where we want to play. These are the things we want to explore. So for example, working with a major global energy provider last year, the CEO of the business in China said, we need to validate a business model if energy were free, because it's going to happen. So what a huge pivot for that business. And of course, you're working with extraordinarily talented, often to PhD level leaders in China, where of course saving face really matters. And so to make experimentation, to give permission and to say, we need to think about this in a new way, and this is how we're going to do it, so that we really do think and act bigger than the status quo, than what we know. And it often doesn't feel natural. And so that support of the senior leadership and the tools, the frameworks, and the permission can really create that space for more experimentation. And Danette, what are you seeing in this regard?
Well, you actually just sort of, when you started talking about, the big investments, and I've read recently the book Quit, and I don't know if you've read Quit. It's an awesome book. The author is Annie Jukes, and she was a professional poker player, And she was talking about the bias of opportunity cost, where once we start investing, we find it really hard to then stop doing things. And she gave some really great examples. And I think what I love about experimentation is we're not doing that big investment necessarily in cost, and we're giving the permission to be able to be open to, let's try a couple of things. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. It's not, the world's not going to end. And so for me, that book really sort of opened up that whole thing of experimentation, where we actually give permission to go, hey, that didn't work. That's okay. What do we learn? Let's move on. And making that part of the culture, I think, just really does help people adapt. I also really loved your point about, where are we in the world, but where is some of those factors happening? And looking, and you've said this many times to me, and I tell many, many people, and I attribute this to you, is about the fact that we need to build our networks so they're global. So even when we're experimenting, what can we pick up from our network that can help us actually inform the experiments to actually make us successful moving forward? So, yeah, they're just some things that came up while you were talking.
I love that. And absolutely, experimentation, it's like, let's experiment in the light, not in the dark. And there's nothing better, or the next best thing to being a student, when you're a particularly university student and you can reach out to people and say, can I have a chat to you about this because I'm writing this assignment or I'm doing this project? And the next best thing is running an experiment in a business and reaching out to someone and saying, this is what I'm working on and I would love to tap into your expertise. And if you can do it in a way that makes it win-win, of course, 99% of people say yes to a conversation. And what we can learn from people who are even less resourced and less constrained by sunk cost fallacy, the need to extract more return from previous investment or projects that have been approved. And there's, even in Western societies, there is a need to save face. It can be really interesting to look at low and middle income countries, particularly middle income countries, where they have almost more of a white, like a blank page. And often they have a limiting beliefs of what they can do because they're not an advanced economy. We don't have the political stability. We don't have that level of resources. We don't have the expertise. And it's saying, hang on a minute, is that true? Is there a lower cost way of doing this? And experimenting around those assumptions is hugely valuable. In particular, when we also need to compare that with, in parts of the world, including where I'm currently sitting, we do hold on to past investment or decisions more tightly. There's legacy that plays a big role in what we can do. And so when we are untethered based on, we've just got more ground to cover, that is a really important fact, I think, to consider when you are a new player, you're in an under-resourced organization, a startup, or even in a country. It's looking at what is possible. Let's be accurate with that, and having conversations with people from around the world to see what they're building off the smell of an oily rag is hugely inviting and inspiring. And it's also really important for us to know, sitting here, that what is possible is accelerating, and we can find so much inspiration and invitation from all corners of the world.
Love that. And you reminded me, and I don't know who said this, but it was, if I give you $20 and you have to come up with a solution, I basically box you in because that $20 becomes what you fixate on. If I give you nothing, the world is your oyster, because you then can go, well, how do I create this? But I don't have any constraints because it's not focused on $20. It's focused on, well, how do I just achieve this with potentially nothing? And I remember when Jez was young, he found this book and it was called The Red Paperclip. And that particular guy, Kyle McDonald, he was a 19-year-old podcaster in Canada who managed to take a red paper clip and in 12 months and let's say 14 trades, he ended up with a 2-story farmhouse because he was willing to learn to ask and swap different things. So I think even when the moment we start constraining, we've only got these resources, that limits what our brain's going to see as possible. So I love that idea of going out to the network globally and looking at, all sorts of different cultures, etc., to go, okay, what is possible? Maybe not necessarily costing a lot of money.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah. So my next question is, why is it important for leaders and organisations that want to adapt? Why should they be considering experimentation?
I wonder if a good question to ask inside established organizations is, and for leaders that are working within those established organizations and maybe mid to senior career, because there has been the way of doing things. I wonder if a good question to ask is, I wonder what success looks like.
Love that question.
Yeah, what does success look like over there? And it could be in an adjacent industry. It could be indeed in a low income country. It could be in an agile startup that's starting to move in your space. And so I think the follow-up question is, who is working to be the globally dominant player in our space? And start casting your eyes on who has that ambition. And they also have the agency, if they are experimenting and leveraging tools, leveraging networks, leveraging all that is possible to access globally. What are they hungry to achieve and how are they doing it? And when we know that and we explore we ask those questions and we explore those answers, that leads to leaders and organizations sensing that they need to adapt. And let's do it in a way, of course, where it is de-risked. And experimentation, as we've said, is the very best way. So it's expanding our worldview, looking at what's possible, who's hungry, who's ambitious, who's working really hard, and how does the agency of those that are doing that, how does that accelerate or boost, lift our ambition? And ambition can be a bit of an ugly word. Not everyone loves it. And yet there's very ambitious business leaders, entrepreneurs in the world. And they're not always chasing zero-sum outcomes, winner takes all. In many corners of the world, there are people, leaders, entrepreneurs who are passionate about creating positive sum, win-win outcomes. And that's the sort of ambition that is absolutely wonderful. And increasingly, they don't have to ask for permission. They don't have to have vast resources. They don't need formal education. I mean, we've seen the teenagers starting startups in garages. That's been around for a few decades. And it's becoming less centralized. It's decentralized now, where it's in all corners of the world with just a smartphone, just internet connectivity. And there's 5.55 billion people with an active internet connection. And so when we can see where is their ambition, with amplified ambition, with accelerated agency, when we see that, we can question who we are and what we're doing in the world, and we can adapt who we know, what we know, how we work, and what we aim for accordingly.
What a great answer. Love that. So we're just about at the end of the podcast. It's such a good conversation. So my next question is around experimentation. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers?
I think it's really this link between ambition and agency. When we know more is possible, we tend to aim higher. And I don't know about you, Danette, but I've felt And I know that clients, particularly working in large organizations, sometimes in government agencies and so on, they're sitting at their desks and they're feeling really confined. They're feeling really limited with how they can do their job, how they can climb the ladder, or whatever it is. And what we can do is, as an individual, at any level, we can always get out and explore in the world. We can run our own personal experiments. We can take agency in our own hands and ambition in our own hands. And sometimes when something's a little bit proven, that's when we can get greater buy-in internally. You and I have probably countless times always already seen in our working lives, those good ideas that take a bit of time to get buy-in. But once they are validated, particularly with it might be, some validation with experts based at certain institutions or whatever it might be, some expression of interest to support financially, whatever it is. There's this relationship between ambition and agency. And what I would say for anyone feeling stuck, or anyone with very limited resources in an organization of any size, anywhere, is just reach out to people and start having conversations. Conversations with new people is a really fabulous experiment. And why do that? I mean, the world feels pretty wild right now, and yet the world is truly wonderful. And there are amazing people, as we've touched on, amazing entrepreneurs, kids in garages. You're building products, services, solutions. They're designing what we need for a better future. Find them. Build your own personal advisory board. Invite them to sit on it and raise you, sort of look beyond the horizon, see the world of possibility and start bringing it into your own world.
Sophie, I know that at the moment there's a lot of people in Australia that are sort of struggling, how do we experiment, given there's a lot of people in fear, there's talks of recession, etc. I'm really curious, what are you seeing in Australia, and how can we use that actually to expand our worldview, for argument's sake?
Australia, we are in a really fortunate position to have, we're the only industrialized nation to not enter a recession post GFC. We've had really good times, and there are so many external shifts, and yet I'm not sure if we've quite hit the tipping point. There is a lot of fear, and you can understand it. And I wonder when reality will bite, like when times will um, be really, really tough, where we have a lot of businesses outside of, construction, housing construction, sort of going bust. And I do feel for those leaders that have 5 or so years left in their professional lives. They've probably got personal ambitions. They've got investments, investment goals they want to reach, professional milestones that they're wanting to reach. And yet, what a wild world to wrap up your career. I mean, in 5 years' time, the world politically, the political cycles will be very different, strong economic cycles. How do they ride those waves? And in Australia, we have, we're a very small job market. So it's not sort of the case in other parts of the world where you can just jump and move. I mean, 5 years in a large market, let's just say Europe for example, in 5 years you can move to another large corporate, for example, and have a really fantastic time in that final phase of your career. In Australia, that's harder to do. We just don't have as many opportunities. And not many leaders I speak to want to shift to, working remotely or moving to Singapore, for example. They want to stay with family. They've got their lives and their livelihoods that they're wanting to, maintain some continuity with. And yet we hear a lot in the news in Australia about productivity. We've got decreasing productivity, and it tends to focus on how do we extract more value from doing the same. And that, if you're working in those organizations, you can feel like you're the hamster on the wheel. And that, of course, doesn't lead to greater productivity. And it can feel like there's very little to play with. And so what we can see in some other parts of the world, where there might be less predictability, like it's been an environment of less predictability and higher growth opportunities, because our economy's been stable, and yet we don't have huge economic opportunities domestically. And certainly not everyone wants to expand internationally. We have quite low records of that, certainly in big business. And so we know that a way to counteract this, and those leaders that are looking to retire within 5 years, I think you're spot on, Danette, with your spotlight on experimentation. And a really key aspect in Australia, because we can also experience this island mentality where we're so far away from the world, and there are limited resources. It can be really hard right now to get big budget approval. And this spotlight on experimentation is perfect, because those leaders emerging, and particularly those established ones that are set to leave, we don't need to know it all. We do not need to know it all. Where we needed to be the expert we had to prove ourselves as being the expert when we were rising through the ranks in the past. Now there's real power in saying, I don't know, but let's find out.
What a great answer. Great advice. So, Sophie, I reckon there'll be some listeners who'd like to reach out to you. So where would be the best places for them to find you?
Yeah, fantastic. The top 2 places, I am online at sophiekrantz.com. So SophieKrantz.com. And that's also where you'll find me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming back for season 3. As always, the conversations are amazing. And I'd just like to thank all of our listeners and our viewers, and stay adaptable.
And what a wonderful chat that was with Sophie, Danette. What a lovely
Totally
conversation. And it's great to see you two, friends of the show and friends in real life, chatting on Adapt. What was some of the key takeaways for you from that chat, Danette?
I loved her bit about experimentation versus distraction, and also how it's important that we not only provide the tools but the permission to be able to experiment. And for each of us as individuals, no matter whether you're a leader or where you sit in an organisation, we have the ability to take agency and ambition into our own hands. And it can be as simple as starting a conversation with a new person. So she had some really practical takeaways that I'm sure our listeners and viewers would find really helpful. What about you, Jez?
It's just when you hear from Sophie, in a world that feels a little chaotic sometimes, I feel like there's something about what Sophie says that's about harmony and like the way that we can all help each other. It's such a beautiful message.
Yes.
And so, I just love that when you when I hear these conversations, it's been true of all of them, but it's definitely true of this one as well. It's just like how much she understands that each culture has such an advantage, and that if you can harness all those advantages with each other, there's just such a cohesive advantage for all of us to work with. So, no, I love hearing conversations with Sophie, and it's always a pleasure.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, Danette, I think without further ado, let's jump into our listener question segment.
Awesome.
Ask and Adapt. All right, this is Ask and Adapt, the segment where you can write in and ask questions to Danette that you need help with adapting or experimentation this season. Danette, today's question is from Mary, and Mary has written in, and she's written, Dear Danette, we are now in the second half of the 2020s decade. What have you learned since the decade begun about how to be adaptable as times have changed? Thank you, Mary.
What a great question, Mary. And it's actually, the moment I saw this question, I was like, that's a question every single listener and viewer should ask themselves as well, because that reflecting back to go, what did I learn and what can I carry forward? Super, super important. So for me, one of the things I always reflect is that power of investing in yourself. So taking the time, whether it's listening or watching a podcast, whether it's reading, whether it's experimenting and then reflecting on that, all of that helps us to learn and grow. And I think that helps us stay adaptable in a decade that, half a decade, we weren't really talking about AI very much 3 years ago. Look at it now. So, that constant remembering that time you're investing in yourself, it's not an expense for my accountant friends. It's actually an investment in your future value, etc. I also think that keeping that growth mindset, so staying open, staying curious. I don't know that. Wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. Who else could I talk to? And going back to Sophie's conversation earlier about building that global network to improve your access to just different perspectives, which again helps us to be innovative. The other thing that I'd say is it's really important to have a good team around you too. So I'm so grateful that I have this fabulous team, including yourself, Jez, which are constantly looking at different ways to do things. So that keeps me at the top of my game as well. And I think the other one that's really important is looking after yourself. So making sure that you create space to look after your health, your well-being, and not always pushing, because it's actually in the space where our brain does the great heavy lifting. So remembering that looking after yourself, taking those regular breaks actually is going to make you long-term sustainable.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think staying on that, I mean, looking after yourself in a world that's changing so much, giving yourself as much room and space as you can, I think is really important. It's a lesson that I think that we've all had to start to learn a bit more as the 2020s have kind of gone on and things have been shifting quite quickly. The more space you can create in your life in different pockets, whatever that means to you, I think is so important.
Yes.
I thought that more than anything, this question really points to adaptability and how important it is, and I would again encourage people to not only check out all the other episodes of this particular podcast, but read your book about adaptability, because you've got a model in here that people can apply, the accepts model, which we can talk about a little bit, but you've also really got it laid out a way of looking at the future that is changing, accepting that the only constant is change, and going, how can we live in a world where that's actually going to be helpful and I can actually survive in that? So I think that's good. The other little tip I always have with the 2020s that I've noticed that's been very helpful for me is focusing in as much as you can on something, because with everything exploding in so many different directions, if you can sort of manage to have a broad understanding of one area, that's so valuable to other people, because that means they don't have to look at that area that much, that you can be their resource to translate all the different things that's happening. So, for example, in podcasting, I'm that for us. I can obviously play with our sort of I've experimented with our layouts, we've looked like this, and different things, but I've decided this is kind of the best look. But that's all through trial and error. I am every week trying different things. And so I think that that's also important. But the Adaptable Leader by Danette Menzies, that's another great resource I direct people towards.
Thanks. Cheers.
Well, Danette, did you have any other things that you wanted to leave our listeners with for this episode?
I just think that investing in your global network will be a way that helps you stay adaptable. Sophie's shared some fabulous advice, and I'd encourage everyone to think of themselves as an artist, a creative, and I really like that initiative by the Irish government, because ultimately, how you create value for yourself and for organizations is by being more adaptable, by being able to experiment and innovate. And a book that I love for that is called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's been around forever, but if you don't think you're creative or you want to improve your creativity, it is a fabulous, fabulous resource. Thanks, Jez.
That's all right. No, I think that's great, Danette. Well, if people want to hear from your international network and someone internationally, stay tuned for next week, because we're interviewing Dr. Mehdi. And that's a very interesting conversation. So that's an international conversation. But I guess, did you want to leave everybody with anything, Danette?
Well, until next time, stay adaptable, everyone.